So it's so nice to be with you all today. I've realised in pandemic that I'm willing to go anywhere and do anything that does not involve self-view because I'm so sick of looking at myself. So it's really lovely to be looking at all of you today. I have to give Barry massive kudos for Anne and Graham being before me because they could not have queued me up better. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about what I've learned in the last year or so about how observation, observability and transformation for large organisations and complex systems really go hand in hand. I'm going to kick off my timer because I'm a terrible chatterbox. So you can all start waving at me when I've been going on for too long. So in my day job, I'm a managing director at JP Really, I'm a software engineer. I would be writing Java code if anyone would let me, but these days they don't. So I really, a lot of the problems that Graham was talking about there about, spending all our time paying for data and we don't know what it is. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how observability thinking and how you consider observability, what it's for and how you should use it can help to sort of start change how organizations are using their data. And if we want to be sustainable, we really need to understand what are our workloads, how do they operate, what do we care about? Because actually you can't manage your environment if you don't understand it. And observability is really all about that. The punchline from my talk is that observability is not telemetry, and that's why, right? So if you got bored and went for coffee, that was it. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Larry Tesler. So when I grew up, I'd like to be Larry Tesler. Sadly, he died last year, but he invented cut and paste. And if you're a UX person, you should read up on Larry Tesler. And Tesler's law of irreducible complexity really says you cannot take the complexity out of systems. The only question is who gets to deal with it. And I always joke that the answer is inevitably almost always me. But really, you've got a choice. Either developers deal with complexity or users deal with complexity, but you don't get to move it away. And I think about this now as a who, where, what problem. So the who problem is almost inevitably your SRE teams or whisper it, your operations teams actually have to deal with complexity, or even worse, your customers hate it so much they don't buy your business. But the where problem is really compelling. So Anne talked a lot about that. So even 10 years ago, I could probably tell you, because I'm a details person, where our production systems were physically running on any given day. So we might have had massive complicated systems. I've run a lot of big platforms for JP but I could have told you which data center they were running in, whether they were on prod or DR, what was active-active, what was active-passive. 10 years later, I would not even guess where my workload is working. And to Anne's point, actually, the goal should be that you don't care. But in order to do that, you have to understand how you're going to manage an ever-increasing amount of complexity. The parameters have shifted. You can't make it a simpler problem. All you can figure out is how to manage it. And then if you think about, that's the where, and the answer is who knows. And then the what is, observability is really about understanding the health of a business transaction and how your customers experience it. It's actually not, I hate to say it, about understanding your systems. Although if you don't understand them, it's harder to understand how your business transactions are doing. But it's really about that, and that's the big so what of observability. Really what it lets you understand is what matters to you, which is your business. So if I'm going to talk a little bit about observability versus telemetry, and I kind of spoiled the punchline a little bit there. Telemetry really came from a networking background. It was about understanding how a packet got from A to B across a very complicated ecosystem. And honestly, I sort of long for that being the problem we had to solve. But if you take a step back, observability is really one step up from there. It's about understanding the what you care about, and the tools that you use to enable that are actually what enables you to understand that problem. So getting away from where is your packet, because you never care about that, but you do really care about whether a customer can check out their cart when they're finishing a purchase. And if you were kind of wondering the why should you care, the State of DevOps report, which for anyone who's not read it, is really worth a read, correlates very closely with data, the performance of businesses with the level of SRE capabilities that their organizations can evidence. So orgs that do this well make more money is the punchline. So you should care about this because it matters for your business, for your shareholders, for you. So the industry would tell you, and I can't tell you how much, I've been doing the job that I'm doing for about a year, and I own all of our observability tools for JP and the market is hot. Some lovely sponsors on the market with us today. And there's a kind of myth that there's 3 pillars of observability. It's actually not true, but I will talk to you about what they are. So when you touch on tools, you've got metrics, traces, and logs. Metrics are granular time series data. They tell you things like how much memory you're using at different percentiles of your ecosystem. And you have tools like Prometheus that can actually help you to understand that. So when we run queries, we might say, give me the 99th percentile of a memory utilization metric for the last 24 hours, and it lets you understand how much reserve capacity you're actually consuming in your production platforms, for example. It's highly granular. I had a partner who recently asked me to send them all the raw data for a particular metric, and I had to politely explain that it was 30 million unique time series metrics in the last 90 days, and I probably couldn't fit it in a spreadsheet, but I could explain to them what it told us, right? And I'm going to come back around and talk a little bit today actually about the open standards and open source that we're using in this environment, because it's actually really pretty powerful. Traces are like isotopes for your code. In case I forget to say this later, please do not use traces to reverse engineer your systems. I'm kind of worried that that's what people are starting to do, but traces actually let you trace the path of an execution across a distributed microservice environment, and they're really, really important. It's how you instrument the business that you're there to serve. And then logs, most people are familiar with. Unstructured data, I'm going to call them the problem child of observability, right? There's a bit more of a journey. Metrics and traces are actually quite a bit more mature in terms of open standards than logs, which are kind of lagging behind. I'm going to take a minute actually just to talk about logs before I go on. So I've been writing Java codes or reviewing Java code for the last 25 years. And honestly, logs have not changed. The way that we write logs hasn't changed. I'm almost never not disappointed when I look at logs. We kind of they're mostly junk, right? We don't curate them. Most developers don't love it if you come and tell them we have standards for logs. But there's a really important fundamental thing here. You have to think differently about how you generate data for observability if you ever hope to understand your platforms and systems, okay? So the way that we used to do logging, like, that's the past. And observability is the future. And if you don't start understanding that if you have not designed domains well with identifiers that will let you understand your transactions, you will never get further along this journey. Your data will continue to fill up in boxes that no one can understand. So you have to start thinking about how to transform the way that your engineering teams, your partners, your designers, your SRE teams start to think about these problems. So that's my minor moan about logs. I've got that off my chest. I feel much better now. So not to shame anyone, but I went and got some examples from the internet of how you should do metrics, traces, and logs to talk about why, if you're not intentional about how you use these things, they don't take you on the journey that you could otherwise go on. So if you're going up Everest and you're at base camp, if you want to summit, you have to think differently about how you use these examples. So this is an example from the internet of how to do metrics, and as you can see I touched on earlier quantiles. Metric standards do nice things like define how we describe time. So we use epoch time, which gets us out of being really confused about which time zone that was in and having non-consecutive metric data values. And this one's about garbage collection, which is one of my personal bugbears. So it basically says this is how long garbage collection took. So far, so good, right? Except here's the question. How many of the people in your team understand what that tells them? Does that mean your system hung? Was there a pause for a full GC that a user would think was a timeout and give up and wander off? What does that tell you? Because you can publish all the metrics you like, but if you don't understand what it is that the signal they're providing is, that's a lot of data you're paying to not know anything else, okay? So I would be really thoughtful about this. This is the equivalent of kind of spewing out all your data, but you have to really be thoughtful about what does it mean. Okay. So coming off a bit negative today, I'm going to get to the good bit in a minute. So this is an example for traces. So traces have context, and there's an open telemetry product called Baggage, which is amazing. And if I was to kind of say, you know, the solution to Graham's problem is mostly baggage. It's all about how you tag with name value pairs your data. But this is an example where you're creating a span, and your span is context for a trace that you want to store about your path of execution, and you're adding an event to your child span so that you can then say a customer was making a deposit, this span is actually the balance account part of that transaction, and then they log to the inimitable service A end do work, right? And all hope was lost. What could that possibly tell you, right? So if you say, oh yeah, it was do work, like my point being, I know these are generic examples, but actually people take them literally. You must be thoughtful about how you name and use data in your span traces, okay? It's the difference between useful and not useful. So this is, I touched a bit on logging earlier. So of the OpenTelemetry, OpenTracing and OpenCensus came together in OpenTelemetry, and OpenTelemetry is a thing of great hope. It's the shining beacon of open standards for observability. And actually, if you're really religious about adopting them, you can really simplify your ecosystem, and it can also give you a little bit of decoupling from vendor lock-in, so it's very attractive. Logs are the least stable specification in OpenTelemetry today. They have the longest journey to go on. There's a kind of anti-pattern for using logs to debug your code. And I'll illustrate with an example. One of the conversations I have with people sometimes is about how are you organized to operate the products and platforms that you care about? And logging is a great example. One team will say to me, I need to be able to get access to everyone else's logs, and I genuinely wonder what they're going to do with them, right? How many engineering teams have you met that could actually make sense of a log that was written by another engineering team about a different system that they're not familiar with? I'm going to say that number's very small, okay? So it certainly is the biggest opportunity, and this kind of stuff, like something happened, here's the exception, is actually still what I see a lot, even in quite good engineering teams. So logs remain probably our biggest opportunity. They're also, right now, our largest source of unused data. I would have to say traces are going to very rapidly become our next much, much larger source of untagged, unused data if we're not careful. So I said it was going to get a bit better. What should we do about all of this? So I have to say that actually when you think about solving this problem, you should first think about how do you design systems? How do your Agile teams include design in your Agile rituals? If your team are not having a process where you write, actually that was one of the few really good things that came out of pandemic for us. We really got pretty rigorous about writing down our shared mental models. What's the state model for your transaction? If you're designing a saga, do all the teams that are working on parts of that saga understand the role that their service should play? It's a huge opportunity to make operating your platforms later much easier. But actually, arguably, it's the change that will make the lives of the developers in your teams, and oh my God, I hope your SRE team's much better. So whether you're doing a really modern DevOps environment and your teams run their own platforms, developers get fed up and quit when they get paged all the time because they weren't encouraged, enabled, and frankly expected to spend time designing to operate your platforms. Figure out what your interaction diagrams look like. Document your user journeys. Think about what is the business transaction. If you're using BDD, kind of don't care what you use for it, but what's the business transaction that you're building that you then want to operate and observe, and how can you make that not a thing that gets everyone out of bed in the middle of the night, right? The goal actually for really well-observed systems is that you rarely get anyone out of bed in the middle of the night. You kind of have two paths for observability. You have a real-time path for observability, which is my system up? Is it working? Is something horribly gone wrong? And then the secondary path is something went wrong and we don't really understand what happened and we want it not to happen again. So if you like forensics after the event. And there's a real religious war about, on the one hand, I'll be told by people, don't let anyone keep any data for more than 2 weeks, Marnie. Right? And then I'll have other people saying, no, it's observability, we keep everything forever, right? It's probably a middle ground, but the reality is if you want to do either of those things well that won't make your people burn out and quit, you need to really think about designing for what it is that you care about observing, okay? So if I could say anything to you with great enthusiasm, is that actually how your teams do design and how they work together is the most important change you'll make to allow you to do observability really well. I hate to say it, it's not all about the code. That depresses me. Actually, just for a minute as well, I'm going to labour a little bit on namespaces. So everything in observability thinking now is about being able to join the dots. You can only join the dots across metrics, traces, logs, alerts, events, customer experience metrics. If you've actually thought about your domains, your namespaces, and then how you inject those correlating IDs as traces into all your observability data types, okay? It's really important. The missing leg of observability is actually customer experience. So even when you read up on, some people talk about events, they talk about alerts, they might talk about app performance monitoring. They rarely talk about how do you know what the experience is like for your customer. So, you get an alert that says system X is really slow, or you're getting 500s or 503s, and you think, well, that's not good. Do you actually know if it's a problem? A lot of the time, no, not really. Do you know how many transactions were abandoned in your environment because your customer got fed up because of that? And that will help you prioritize your backlogs. Where should your team spend their time? what's the cost to the business, right? Is it a slightly annoying 503 thing that just recovers by itself because you've got auto-scaling on and something just restarted in the background, woo, right? Or is it actually something that's meaning that you should make this #1 because it's the biggest drop transaction driver in your environment, okay? And that's really important because particularly for new businesses, you only get a one chance to make a first impression. If you don't know that's the impression you're making, how do you know where to spend your time, okay? So namespaces and being able to trace activity through your environment all the way to the customer experience is where namespaces and domains really matter, okay? So this is a great bit of research that �����𝒂𝒅𝒆 company, Honeycomb.io, did. I'm not here to at all validate anyone's company, but I will just take a minute. I think �����𝒂𝒅𝒆 is a thought leader in this field, and she's just published a great book about observability, so I don't get any revenue through it, but I would recommend it. It's a great read. So they did a survey about SLOs and SLIs, and really what this is about understanding the maturity of companies on this journey who are kind of in the DevOps environment. And you have the nascent metrics on the right, and then the more mature metrics on the left. And interestingly, SLIs are really important and probably not the thing we talk enough about. So 78% of teams are measuring service level objectives. Service level indicators is how you know you have a problem. And in order to know you have a problem, you have to know what normal looks like. And again, that's where your observability data comes in. What's the normal pattern of business at this time of day, in this month, in this week, in this region, okay? This is kind of also for most teams a kind of next level thing. For advanced SRE teams, there's nothing unusual about this, but when we talk about service level availability, did you mean was it up? Or did you mean was it up and working? Or did you mean was it up and working and fast enough? Okay, so it's really useful to be specific. Correctness is a great metric. If you've got a balance for a customer, you'd want to give them a correct balance on the whole. So in some systems that matters a lot. We should be measuring the things that we care about. So I touched a little bit on defining what matters, right? So design for it so that you can later observe it. Really importantly, you should also be really thoughtful about how you test it. So I would suggest to you that one of the challenges we have with this is that we don't build representative environments. It's probably pretty much, it's probably a gone art. I'm not sure anyone's trying to build representative environments anymore. I would say test in production is where we're at. And that really might mean having the ability to flip your environments off in the background, to have a really good blue-green model, push things out in limited impact, and actually run synthetic testing. So if you wanted to start somewhere, and you're not going to re-architect all the things you've already built, start with synthetic testing, because it's the best chance that you can have to understand actually external in what is the health of your system. I had a vendor who shall be nameless come and say to one of our big platform teams at JP Morgan, and then you plug your thing into our thing and you switch it on and you get traces. And I was like, oh, right, like that's not true. What he means is you'll get CPU and memory data, but we get that already from our APM tools. So if you don't have the ability to go back and invest in writing traces, then run synthetics in production would be my advice. The other thing that I would say to you, to kind of think about how do we do it better is I get asked quite a lot because I own the tools to come and give teams, maybe telephony teams and call centers advice about how to do this in their environment. And the first question has to be, well, how are you organized to do this in the environment? When we start mapping the systems flow, we'll quite often find that, and it's that old paradigm that our business is built around the organizational boundaries. So you might have a transaction that starts over here in one organization, spans 4 to the right, and then lands back in the left. And then they say to me, Marnie, why have you not built a tool to solve this problem? And I'm like, that's kind of difficult because there's 16 operational teams in the mix. So you have to also be really clear about how do you want to run as a business? How do you want your teams to work together? Do you want them to hand off between teams along your domain boundaries? Or actually have you thought about how to horizontally operate? Because if you haven't done that, this is going to be hard and there's going to be handoffs and some of them might be in the middle of the night, right? So I touched on the last leg of observability being the customer's experience. Really observability can give you good answers to your questions if you know what they are. It's a mindset shift to get away from caring about data and telemetry and to move towards caring about the things that matter for you and your customers. But for me, the big takeaway here, having spent, December on Log4j, as probably some of you did, would be it's an unmissable opportunity to make the lives of your teams better. And I couldn't encourage you more vigorously to think about the ways in which you must change the way that Agile engineering teams work to make that possible. So that's my so what, and thank you very much for listening.